Hi there, good morning. Happy after Christmas Day. This is David Roche, this is Quantum Strategy, and this is the micro podcast on macro matters. We've had the industrial profit figures out of China. They're pretty ghastly, not exactly collapse figures, but pretty ghastly. If you look at the figures, they're down 7.3% in year on year in November. It was worse in September, minus 27%. But if you look into the detail of the figures, what you find is that sales, the top line of corporations, is increasing much slower than the costs of making those sales. So sales are up 1.8%, and they're not improving. They actually got worse month on month. And the costs were up 2.3%. So what you're actually looking at is a deflationary corporate sector, which obviously therefore cannot make any profits. And if you look into the profit figures, you will find that the state-owned enterprises, in particular, the ones that are getting all the stimulus packages, were absolutely ghastly. And their profit figures were well down, where the private sector was at least in the black, but just. So the deflationary impact on China, we have to recap what that actually means. It means, number one, corporations can't make profits, which we've just seen, but it also means the tax revenues of governments remains very slack, because it is only the top line that generates profits. Now, I want to talk about what could happen in China without appearing to be a guru. There are a number of distortions which are happening, and we have to think about what this actually means for 2025. The first distortion is the fact that a lot of consumer sales are being pulled forward because there are many subventions which encourage people to swap old domestic appliances for new ones, to swap old cars for new EVs. What that actually does, it takes a chunk of demand away from down the road and replaces it in the present time. That's called pulling the demand forward. We're in the middle of that period. We're also in the middle of that period, I think, for property, because we saw quite a sharp bounce in the major 30 cities on new home sales during a couple of weeks in December. And those new home sales are up about 15%. But are they being bought by people who need them for homes? I have my doubts, because what we are looking at is people who have already 80–70% of their portfolios in property, and they're worried about their future work income. So it does appear that they're unlikely to be the final buyers. And I think what we're seeing is the effect of stimulus encouraging local governments and banks to actually buy up houses as they've been instructed to do by their political masters, but not as a bounce in final demand. So the third pulling forward I want to go into is that China's exports have been pretty buoyant in recent months and provided a considerable prop to the economy. But any Chinese entrepreneur with his head screwed on in vaguely the right direction will be trying to pump all of his product into the United States that he can before President Trump takes office and increases tariffs. So I suspect that the Chinese economy, the stabilization and slight recovery that we're seeing, is based on three pull forwards. One we've just discussed, which is exports trying to get into America before the tariffs are put on. Two is the fact that households are being encouraged to replace old machines with new and getting government subsidies to do so. And the three is that the stimulus is resulting in an uptick in property transactions because it is being used, as the government has instructed the recipients of stimulus to do. They're being bought up by those agents and not by final demand. Now, if that is the case, we must watch very carefully for the effect of the three pull forwards, as I call them, wearing off in 2025. That's number one. Okay, number two is looking at what could go wrong in 2025. I think there are a number of factors. They could also go right. So remember, I'm a born pessimist. So maybe you want to turn around everything I say, like flipping a coin to the other side. The first thing that could go wrong, I think, is a reversal of global interest rates, policy rates, and long-term bond yields, because the effect of tariffs is to introduce slower growth but higher inflation. And the Fed is ultimately forced, not immediately in 2025, but during 2025, to change course on interest rates. And when all is said and done, markets have been very addicted to lower interest rates. It was the major surprise in 2024. It's not going to repeat itself anyway, but I think it could actually reverse. And I think markets would not like that one single bit. So that's one thing that can go wrong. The second thing that can go wrong is geopolitically. It seems to me perfectly clear that Syria is not going to become a unitary state. Turkey has no interest in pushing Syria to be a unitary state. They just want to wipe out and do a bit of ethnic cleansing of the unfortunate Kurds. But that will mean Syria will remain in chaos. That means that Iran has no corridor through Syria to rebuild its proxies in Lebanon, on the West Bank, or in Gaza. So that means that Iran has no defense policies because the proxies were its defense policy. It will therefore go for broke. It will go for nuclear. It will try to be a nuclear-armed nation by the end of the year. Israel will not stand for that. So the war of wars will be really to completely smash the Iranian regime and its nuclear assets, and God knows what will happen to oil, but it's probably not going to be inoculated against the effects of that sort of a war, the sort of war we have not seen so far. Now, at the moment, Israel is hesitating to do that for two reasons. Number one is President Trump doesn't want more wars, he wants less. And number two is that they need the US at the moment to provide cover against the escalation which Iran would inevitably do once the major war broke out and Israel started to bomb it to hell. Then Iran would have nothing to lose in bombing or sending missiles over Israeli cities. And that is where the Americans come in, because it is they who can provide the almost guaranteed cover to prevent those missiles reaching their target. But America doesn't want to play ball yet. We will see down the road what happens. But that could be a major conflict, and I think it would not be a conflict which would leave, as I say, oil prices indifferent. And the third area, which is starting to look a bit dicey, is Ukraine. Now, General Kellogg is going to do his trip to Ukraine to assess what is going on the ground. And they have been putting out feelers to the Russians, which they would say, well, Ukraine won't be able to join NATO for 10, 20 years, and there will be a peace corridor with NATO troops in it, et cetera, et cetera. But the noise coming out of Russia is incredibly obstinate and obdurate, are the only words I can think of which might suit. They are not playing ball. If Trump's proposals are turned down, then Trump is not going to let Russia get away with it. Trump will be insulted, and he is a machismo type of person. So I think the likelihood is that instead of the Ukrainian war de-escalating, Trump will escalate it in order to force the Russians, whom he knows, if he listens to his intelligence at all, are in a pretty dire economic situation. He will try to push them over the cliff and force them to the negotiating table as their economy really starts to collapse, and the war economy even more so from about the middle of 2025. But that, I think, the size of that escalation would not leave markets indifferent either. So they're the three things I think we ought to watch for next year, in addition to the three pull forwards of demand in China. Now, two things that remain for me to say. One is Russia really has been showing its great expertise by shooting down an Azerbaijani airliner, which was trying to land in Grozny in Chechnya. And they then tried to deny it. Then they tried to say sorry for it without saying that they actually did shoot the airliner down. That insulted the Azerbaijanis. And so Russia, showing its usual sort of thing of a mixture of incompetence, massacre, and failure to actually take responsibility. But most of all, this happened in the North Sea. Now, the North Sea pipeline EstLink 2 was severed. It was probably severed by a ship called the Eagle S, which is a Russian-flagged dark fleet tanker, totally unseaworthy. And what it did was it severed the EstLink 2 cable, which is an electricity cable running to Estonia. This is the fourth incident of Russian or Chinese ships severing undersea infrastructure in the Baltic. And this one is because the Baltic states are about to celebrate becoming autonomous, independent of the Russian electricity grid, Belarusian electricity grid in February 2025. It will have been replaced by two cables. One is the EstLink 1 and 2 cables called EstLink. The EstLink 2 is the one that has been severed. EstLink 1 is still intact, but there is another cable, 700 megawatt cable, which is called the Bolt cable between Sweden and Lithuania. Now, if those three cables are running, then the Baltic states are independent of Russia. If those cables are severed, they are not. And that is the game that Putin is playing. He is trying to sever those cables ahead of the date in February 2025 in which the Baltic states become independent of Russia, finally. It may seem a small thing to you, wherever you are sitting, but to the Baltic states population, and indeed to me, it is a big date, because if you're not independent of the power system of Russia, you're not independent. And that is what Putin is trying to prevent. So finally now, let's get on to what you all were probably listening to, the exciting data for the week, which is not very exciting. It really gets going on January the 2nd and January the 3rd, 2025, when, of course, all the bureaucrats come back and they start spewing data. But there are only really two critical bits of data coming out this week. First, on Tuesday, we've got the NBS manufacturing and non-manufacturing and weighted PMIs for China. So that, obviously, given what we've been talking about, is pretty critical. And then on Friday the 3rd, we have got the US ISM Manufacturing PMI. Now, in between that, we have the Chicago PMI today, so we'll be looking at that particularly for manufacturing data for the US. And going down the list, we have some preliminary PMI data and final PMI data for the EU coming up on January the 2nd, final PMIs for Italy, France, and Germany. And we have the ECB credit data, which is important to see if there's any pickup in credit demand in the European Union, which is, of course, an economy which is much more dependent on bank credit than the United States by about twice as a weight in GDP. So that data will give us some indication as to whether mortgages, so the private households, and above all, corporations are increasing their credit demand. And I will lay you a square bet that it will not be the case. So that is my picture coming into the limbo period between the 25th of December and let's say the 7th of January, I think, when most of you happy people get back to work. Have a good week, and I hope you will continue to listen to this little micro podcast about macro, which after all may matter to markets. Bye, and Happy New Year.